welcome to the 2018 opening Convocation. Please be seated. The academic year is punctuated by ceremonies, and this is one of my favorites. I'm especially pleased to celebrate it with you this evening on our beautiful front lawn. Our distinguished speaker this evening, Professor Ted DeLaney, said that he's a Lexington native and this weather is just fine with him, so we're glad to be outside. Convocation is literally a calling together, not in the ordinary sense that we're called together when it's time to board an airplane, but in the special sense that we reassemble ourselves as a community. In the summer months, we are dispersed. Students travel, faculty immerse themselves in their scholarship, and staff tear down old gymnasiums. Each of us is grateful for the change of pace and season, and yet there's something missing, something that impels us toward this moment when summer hopefully transitions into fall. As students, as teachers, and as staff devoted to providing an environment in which teaching and learning can take place, our avocations, that which we are called to do, require our convocation, our being called together. None of us can be who we most truly are individually without all of us being here collectively, which is why this time of year feels so good. We're once again able to be our best selves. Convocation emphasizes and celebrates the fact that we're an academic community, and that distinctively academic work, with its attendant rhythms, challenges, and pleasures, has commenced. Classes begin at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, unless you're a law student, in which I hope you've been showing up for a couple of weeks. The centerpiece of this ceremony and the kickoff to our year is the address that will be delivered by our distinguished speaker, Professor Ted DeLaney. He will be properly introduced momentarily, but I can't help saying a few words myself about how ideal he is for this occasion and how proud I am to be his colleague here at Washington and Lee. Last year, I created the Commission on Institutional History and Community and asked it to examine how we can do a better job of understanding and teaching our history. It was a no-brainer to appoint Ted to the commission. He served as the head of our history department. He co-founded and directed the Africana Studies program, and he's been an integral member of the working group on the history of African Americans at W&L. The commission rightly emphasized the importance of telling all of W&L's stories to increase awareness of the many different people who've contributed to making this place what it is. When Ted helped to craft that recommendation, I don't think he realized it meant we would embarrass him by telling his personal story at Convocation. But we will, because Ted has not only studied and taught, but lived the last half-century of profound changes at W&L. Ted came to work here as a teenager in 1963, a few years before W&L belatedly took its first tentative steps toward the admission of African American students. Some 2 decades later, at the age of 40, Ted became a full-time student himself, graduating in the same year that women finally enrolled at W&L. He was taught religion by Richard Marks and Harlan Beckley. He was advised and mentored as a historian by Holt Merchant, who encouraged Ted to pursue a PhD and eventually to return to W&L as a faculty member. Ted has given the Founders Day address in Lee Chapel and used the occasion to speak in honor of John Chavis, the first black man to graduate from an American college, who enrolled here at Liberty Hall Academy in 1795. Ted's convocation address will help to fulfill another of his commission's recommendations, that we incorporate our institutional history in the orientation of our students. Last night I led, as did many of you, a small group discussion of Blaine Brownell's book, Washington and Lee University, 1930 to 2000, Tradition and Transformation. Ted wants to make sure that we're all familiar with some of the most important stories in that book, which will be his subject today. Ted DeLaney embodies what is at stake in our work here every day, work that never truly stops, but which officially recommences right now. The occasion is momentous enough that it calls for appropriate music, which we can always count on the university singers to provide. They and their visiting director, Morgan Ludig, will now provide a musical reflection, performing Even When He Is Silent by Kim Andre Arneson. Professor Ludig and the university singers, please take it away. Thank you, University Singers. Our Provost, Mark Connor, will now introduce this evening's featured speaker, Professor Ted DeLaney.
The person who introduces a speaker is always supposed to say, "I'm honored to introduce so-and-so." On this occasion, let me tell you, it is my honor to stand here alongside my friend and colleague of the last 22 years and introduce to you Professor Ted DeLaney. Everyone at W&L knows Professor DeLaney well, and today we get to introduce him to the members of the class of 2022. New members of our community, I am introducing a man you really want to know. Ted DeLaney is a native of Lexington. He grew up only a short walk from this campus and would listen to music from the fraternity parties in his bedroom. He went to school, grades 2 through 12, at Lilburn Downing, at the time the all-black public school. When he graduated from high school, Professor DeLaney was offered a United Negro College Fund scholarship to attend Morehouse College in Atlanta. His mother, who was divorced with 5 children, worried about having him that far from home during the often violent days of the early civil rights movement. Instead, he enrolled in a Franciscan monastery for a year, but returned home when he discovered that was not what he was being called to do. Back in Lexington, he went to work at Washington & Lee in 1963. He was 19, and he started as a janitor. Then the professors in the biology department quickly recognized his talent and asked him to become the department's lab technician. He took care of the greenhouse. He set up labs. He became an integral member of the campus community over the next 2 decades, indispensable to faculty and staff and admired by students. In 1979, Professor DeLaney decided to take advantage of the W&L perk that allows staff to take a free class at the university. He started taking 1 course a year as a part-time adult student. 4 years later, he quit his job and became a full-time student. He was 40 years old. In 1985, he graduated cum laude with a BA in American History from Washington & Lee. After teaching at the Asheville School for 3 years, Professor DeLaney went to the College of William and Mary to earn his PhD in American History. From 1991 to 1993, Professor DeLaney returned to W&L to teach in the history department on a fellowship before spending 2 years as an instructor at the State University of New York in Geneseo. In the fall of 1995, Professor DeLaney came home again when he was named an assistant professor of history at his alma mater. In 2001, he was promoted to associate professor at W&L. He has taught courses in colonial North America, comparative slavery in the Western Hemisphere, African American history, civil rights, and gay and lesbian history. He has taught a legendary spring term course on the Freedom Rides, leading students on a road trip to Selma, Montgomery, Jackson, Birmingham, Memphis, and New Orleans to study the iconic sites of the civil rights movement. From 2008 to 2013, he served as chair of the Department of History. In 2006, along with several colleagues, he co-founded the program in African American Studies, now Africana Studies, a major curricular contribution to Washington & Lee. He has served on numerous committees, including the Commission on Institutional History and Community and the Working Group on the History of African Americans at W&L. Beyond all this formal service, Ted DeLaney is legendary for his one-on-one relations with generations of students. At one point, his advisee load exceeded 40 students. It's not supposed to get above 15. He has devoted untold hours to mentoring, counseling, advising, and encouraging our students for nearly 25 years. This is a service that cannot be measured. It can only be honored. Professor DeLaney and his wife Pat are the parents of a son, Damien, who was 8 years old when he watched his father receive his BA from W&L. In 2003, Professor DeLaney returned the favor, handing Damien his diploma as a graduate of the W&L School of Law. Professor DeLaney plans to retire at the end of this academic year. Should you pass him on campus, let me give you good advice. Remember the speaking tradition and say hello to this man. He has been known to chase students down and insist they put away their cell phones and say hello when they pass by. The title of Professor DeLaney's talk today is W&L History, Traditions, Transformations, and the Consequences of Change. It is fitting that we hear from Professor DeLaney on this subject, since his personal history and the history of this university have been so closely intertwined for the past 55 years. Please join me in welcoming my colleague and friend, Professor Ted DeLaney.
Thank you. And the longer you clap, the longer you'll have to stay out in the heat. So let's bring that to an end. Freshmen should feel, first-year students should feel safe, because it's been a long time since I've had enough nerve to chase people down to make them speak. I do hope that you understand that the speaking tradition is also a mark of the virtue of civility that we like to boast about here at Washington and Lee. I begin by extending a hearty welcome to all new students, faculty, and staff members. Welcome to Washington and Lee and the city of Lexington. I also welcome returning students and wish them the very best for the coming academic year. A few weeks ago, the news office asked why I thought I had been selected to give this speech. Perhaps I was chosen because I'm an artifact, a living fossil who has been on the campus for most of my long life. My connection with W&L spans more than 55 years, and it has been multifaceted. Since age 19, I've done many things here. My jobs have ranged from custodian, laboratory technician in biology, full-time student, worker on the circulation desk in the library, ABD teaching fellow, tenured faculty member, and head of the history department. No one listening to my voice has experienced so many facets of W&L and over such a long period of time. When Provost Connor asked me to speak, he asked me to reflect on the assigned reading for freshman orientation, or anything else I'd like to talk about. My choice was the assigned reading for freshman orientation. That reading comes from 2 chapters of a splendid new book written by my friend Blaine Brownell, a member of the class of 1965. It was published last year. The chapters assigned to the first-year students tell the story of racial desegregation and the admission of female undergraduates to Washington and Lee, 2 transformative events in W&L history. Events that, in my view, transformed W&L from its previous status as a Southern regional college into a nationally ranked liberal arts institution. That was the consequence of those 2 important decisions. I sincerely hope the first-year students gave those 2 chapters a careful read and enjoyed them as much as did I. You are indeed fortunate that I do not know your names and do not have microphones hidden in the audience, because I would call on you to answer some questions about those chapters instead of standing here lecturing. The overwhelming majority of the audience has not read those chapters. to which I refer, and I offer no apologies about the topic, the choice of topic. My other option might have been to have reflected on my own career at W&L, but it really is a lot harder to talk about myself than it is to talk about institutional history. To those alumni who are listening to this speech, I remind you that historical narratives should be balanced and nuanced. History often involves facts and analysis that we don't like, and the debates over desegregation and the admission of women students were contentious ones. I sincerely hope that you will find my remarks fair and balanced. The topic is particularly relevant to this afternoon for several reasons. First and foremost for me is the topic's relevance to the core values of this university. W&L's mission statement informs us that this university commits itself to honor and civility. There have been times in the past when I have not viewed the university's policies as consistent with those core values, but I've always been hopeful that good would prevail. Second, the Board of Trustees recently approved a new strategic plan that recommits Washington and Lee to these values and adds the statement, quote, "We will increase racial, socioeconomic, and international diversity of students, faculty, and staff." So that's in the strategic plan. Third, the strategic plan notes that W&L aspires to be a national leader for liberal arts education in the 21st century. It states, quote, "Our community of trust and civility, our distinctive curriculum, our commitment to institutional citizenship for the benefit of society, and our beautiful historic campus are a potent educational combination." One of the factors that influenced my return to Washington and Lee in 1995 was this commitment to these values. I left a state university where students and faculty were ideologically liberal to return to W&L, not because I sought a conservative environment. I returned to W&L because W&L and Lexington are my home. As noted before, I grew up only a short walk from the campus and rode my bicycle past this chapel as I was a boy. I love W&L far more than I dislike its past failures to live up to those values. As a 17-year-old, I could not apply to W&L because I'm black, and would graduate some 24 years later at the age of 41. I came here to work at age 19, and from that vantage point, I was able to view both the desegregation decision as well as the coeducation decision. I did not always witness honor and civility from that vantage point as those debates took place. Like Dr. Brunel's account, I find it difficult to describe these events in glowing terms, except to say that the decision to admit black students and women had correct outcomes that ensured the future of Washington and Lee as a prestigious institution. From my perch, the desegregation and coeducation debates, I sometimes overheard students and a few faculty members defend the status quo based merely on tradition. W&L should not admit black students because it's never been integrated. W&L should not admit women because it never had women students. Defending tradition for the sake of tradition struck me as anti-intellectual. Was that the best argument these individuals could make? One fraternity decorated the front of its house with a very large banner, a banner that read, "Better dead than co-ed." Imagine that. It would have been better for Washington and Lee to go out of business than to admit women students. Fortunately, the brothers of that fraternity had only the power to express their opinion, and that they did. More important, I was finishing up my coursework in the winter and spring of 1985, and the students who invited me to be part of their study groups were much more thoughtful and positive about the coeducation decision. Instituting change is always fraught with tremendous risk, and sometimes it presents incredible opportunities for new leadership. Such was the case with desegregation. According to Dr. Brownell, W&L missed the opportunity to become a leader among small Southern colleges on the racial desegregation issue. Instead, the trustees dug in their heels to preserve the status quo, and later those trustees discovered that neither private foundations nor the federal government would continue to give financial grants to segregated institutions. In 1964, the trustees resolved that the faculty was free to admit any student they deemed qualified, but barred President Cole from making a news release that announced the desegregation of Washington and Lee. Some viewed such a news release as discriminating against potential white applicants. The conundrum was, how can W&L possibly attract black students if black students don't know that the school is desegregated? More important, the refusal to issue a news release about the desegregation decision suggests that trustees opposed active recruitment of African American students. The decision to coeducate came 20 years later and is similar in some ways and different in others. Oddly, many opponents to the admission of women viewed coeducation as a trend of which W&L should have no part. A trend in 1984? No. The College of William and Mary, my other alma mater, first admitted women in 1919, when many students left college to serve in World War I. President Lyon Gardner Tyler viewed coeducation as a way of saving the College of William and Mary. And even in my own family, my sister Teresa was one of the early female undergraduates admitted to the University of Virginia in the early 1970s. No matter, many W&L alumni persisted in blaming President John Wilson for bringing this trend to W&L. Coeducation was a reality. It was not a trend. Wilson retorted that he had not brought coeducation to W&L. It was Western civilization that brought it here. Wilson noted that Exeter, his own Oxford alma mater, founded in the 1300s, had also coeducated. Similarly, I attest that Western civilization brought desegregation to Washington and Lee. The effort to desegregate the American South parallels with the struggle for European decolonization of African nations during the 1950s and 1960s. Yet the inclusion of blacks and women at W&L were hard-fought battles, and fortunately the outcomes of those battles were correct and had profound consequences. And I did get to know some of the truly good people who were on the correct side of both decisions. One of the high moments of my W&L experience was dining in the home of my friend Barry Sullivan former law school dean, and sitting next to Judge John Minor Wisdom of the Fifth Court Circuit of Appeals. Judge Wisdom was an alumnus and a trustee who was on the correct side of the desegregation vote and a hero of the civil rights movement as he ruled against Southern segregationists from his chambers in New Orleans. Wisdom, who had previously enjoyed social privilege in Louisiana, became an object of contempt because of his judicial rulings. His dogs were poisoned, his family received threatening phone calls, a rattlesnake was thrown into his front yard, but he would not back away from implementing civil rights law because it was the right thing to do. I also knew President Fred Cole in the 1960s, who fully understood desegregation of W&L as being just and the right thing to do. And at the risk of being labeled a name dropper, I also knew and respected people who worked for the admission of women. I knew President John Wilson, and I'm looking directly at his widow as I say that. And to a lesser degree, I knew Rector of the Board Jim Ballingy at the time of the coeducation decision. Both Wilson and Ballingy were good and courageous men. Every historian of the American South knows that the transformation of the southern states between 1945 and 2000 was a period of remarkable progress. But prior to World War II, racial bigotry was not the only form of hate that characterized the South. There was also religious bigotry. For instance, hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan and others sometimes targeted Catholics and Jews. Dr. Brownell did not find evidence of religious bigotry in W&L admissions policies, but such bigotry was not uncommon in Lexington or at W&L. As early as the 1910s, for instance, national fraternities had placed restricted membership codes into their constitutions. As historian Nicholas Thiriet writes, those constitutions specified that members will be white Christians. Consequently, two Jewish national fraternities, Zeta Beta Tau and Phi Epsilon Pi, appeared at W&L and provided a social and religious home for those students. National fraternities would continue to have restrictive covenants, or restricted constitutions rather, as late as 1970, when most universities had already desegregated. As Dr. Brownell notes, the local chapter of Zeta Beta Tau, one of the Jewish fraternities, offered bids to the two black Christian students who matriculated in 1968. That W&L would tolerate fraternities with restrictive constitutions today is unthinkable. My point with this line of argument is that students have enormous power to determine what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in the social practices of a university. If Washington and Lee strives for greater diversity and is loyal to its values of honor and civility, the campus climate must be welcoming and accepting of all students. W&L encourages student self-governance with the expectation that all students will make wise decisions and act justly. Those values of honor and civility are crucial to all members of the W&L community, faculty, staff, and students. During my early years at W&L in the 1960s, I sometimes overheard student comments that were clearly anti-Semitic, comments that made me feel uncomfortable and caused me to wonder what they would say about blacks when I was not present. That such comments were inconsistent with the principles of honor and civility troubled me. On the other hand, many of the biology majors and pre-medical students I got to know during those years were Jewish boys, and they were good and decent and brilliant students. I have many thoughts about Dr. Brownell's chapters on desegregation and coeducation. One is that W&L benefited from the mistakes it made with desegregation. Black student admissions proceeded slowly with no apparent preparation for the arrival of the first black students. Leslie Smith, the first black law student, lived in the dormitory his first year, but quickly discovered the difficulty of finding off-campus housing the following year with his Jewish friend and classmate, Kenneth Satlin. The only option for them was in the black neighborhood. Academically, Leslie excelled, but life on and off campus provided real challenges for him. Satlin reports that some law students refused to sit near Leslie in the dining hall. Leslie lacked black peers with whom he could commiserate or simply relax. Dennis Haston, the first black undergraduate, arrived that same year, but was not Leslie's age peer. And their academic and social experiences were completely different since Dennis resided at home with his family. There were no black professionals on campus in 1966 who could have provided counsel to either Leslie or Dennis. Conversely, W&L was much more cautious with the admission of women. As Dr. Brownell writes, quote, new standards of equity and student responsibility were hallmarks of the post-coeducation era. President Wilson also encouraged departments to hire female faculty members when openings occurred in 1993. Wilson appointed and charged a coeducation review committee to assess progress and continuing challenges. As Brownell notes, they reported that coeducation was proceeding well. In fact, many indicators suggest that by 1993, coeducation was an overwhelming success. Overall enrollment increased from 1,600 increased to 1,600 between 1984 and 1993. The number of applications doubled. The acceptance rate declined. SAT scores for the entering class skyrocketed. Retention from admission to graduation rose to 90% of the student body, and the number of full-time faculty members who were female increased from 6 to 18. Brownell's chapter on coeducation also notes the importance of recruiting female faculty members, not only because it was the right thing to do, it was a vital component to integration of women into the student body. As a co-educational institution, Washington and Lee is no different from any other university. President Wilson and others understood that W&L would now have to deal with unpleasant but universal problems like sexual harassment and assault. And indeed, such problems did occur. During the first 2 or 3 years after my return to W&L in 1995, I had 5 students to tell me that they had been raped. Information that I never could have imagined receiving from anybody. Matters like sexual harassment and assault required the recruitment of female administrators and provided new challenges for the core values of honor and civility. Dr. Brownell notes that the process of hiring women did proceed at a slow pace. The first female faculty member, Dr. Pamela Simpson, was hired in 1973, and the second female faculty member in 1975. After the coeducation decision, the administration actively encouraged departments to include women and minorities in all applicant pools. The number of full-time women professors rose to 18 in 1993. Expansion of the curriculum made this possible. There were only 2 tenure-track African-American professors here in 1993, and one of them was in the School of Law. Some 54 years after desegregation, there are 2 Africans and only 5 African-American undergraduate professors. In spite of a 2001 faculty resolution endorsed by the Board of Trustees that committed W&L to the recruitment of underrepresented minority scholars. I am reminded by one quotation from Dr. Brownell's book that really struck my, it really caught my attention. The quotation comes from 1984 and the editor of the Norfolk Virginian Pilot. And the quotation is this: "Change has never come easily at W&L." My observations over 55 years are certainly consistent with that quotation. Yet I remain hopeful, and the first-year class represents one spark of that hope. You first-year students represent the legacy of those decisions to admit blacks and women students. And as I noted earlier, the inclusion of minorities and women is the reason W&L is a nationally ranked institution. Had it remained all male and all white, it is unlikely that any of you students would be seated here. Of the first-year class, 56% of you are women. Think of that. 5% are international students. 18% are domestic students of color, a term that includes Hispanic, African American, Asians, and other U.S. ethnic minorities. 14% have Pell Grants. 8% are first-generation college students. And probably most important, your SAT and ACT scores indicate that you are absolutely brilliant. Some of you have records also of community service and leadership, which I'm always glad to see. And I hope, selfishly, that all of you major in history, or at least one of the other humanities, and if not that, you should rush to the university store and plan to buy a copy of Dr. Brownell's History of W&L. At least you get to know the history of your university. And there's one thing that I would add. It's a very large book, and it would be much larger if he had added student experiences to those chapters on coeducation and desegregation. But the book is really written from the administrative record and not so much with interviewing and looking for student responses. And so one of the things that we can do as we look at the history of the school is try to ferret out and learn about those student responses as they happened. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Professor DeLaney. May I ask everyone to remain standing for the Washington and Lee hymn. Thank you, University Singers. You may remain standing. I want to close by reiterating what I said at the outset. We're here to do important work, which we can only do together. We're privileged to serve a noble mission to which each of us makes distinctive contributions. This can sometimes get forgotten in the bustle of our daily lives, but I urge you to remember what we do here matters, and doing it well should bring you a deep and deserved sense of satisfaction. I'd like to thank the class of 1942, whose generous gift supports this convocation each year, and I would like to thank the dining services staff for the meal that awaits us on Cannon Green. With that, and in my formal capacity as the president of Washington and Lee, I officially open the 2018-2019 academic year. May it be a good one for all of you. We are adjourned.